Wonderful. Thank you for joining the complimentary webinar hosted by LaingBuisson, powered by Ridout. The purpose of the webinar today, unfortunately, it doesn't take a great deal of explaining. There remain chronic gaps in funding across the sector, yet there are tools, accessible tools, and also expertise in the market that exists to bridge the gaps that exist. So the purpose of the webinar today is to walk you through one of the tools that exists out there, hosted by LaingBuisson. We are then going to have a look at the kind of legal and regulatory elements of that conversation, and then on to kind of tail end into the final user experience out there in the market, and the kind of how the topic of approaching this can be addressed by providers and players in the market. Thank you to everyone for joining. Hopefully you can all hear me loud and clear, which is wonderful. I can see that the numbers are now material, and we're going to get straight into the webinar content. Perfect. So on this note, I'll introduce us to the first person who you will hear from today. It's William Laing from LaingBuisson. William is going to give everybody a demonstration of the toolkit that exists out there in demonstrating some of the gaps that we're seeing in funding in the market.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Liam, for that introduction. And I hope everyone can see the screen, which is showing the opening page of Care Cost Benchmarks together with the sponsor, Ridout.
That's come through for me. Perfect.
Right, amazing. Well, apologies, everyone. We're more used to Teams than to Zoom. But anyway, there we are. So I was talking about the history and how more than 15 years ago we were encouraged, in fact, commissioned by Joseph Rowntree to create the tool, and that was a time when they thought that insufficient money was being paid by local authorities, and really it hasn't changed since, because we're still in a situation where local authorities don't pay adequately, but by and large, and basically the sector works on cross-subsidization from private pay. So what this tool kit is, it's an evidence-based tool to be able to demonstrate in negotiations, such as they are, with local authorities and the NHS, what the actual costs of care are. So I'm going to go straight into the model to show you how it works. So if I click on Quick Start, what that takes me to is a page where I can select any local authority that I wish to, and I can click it here, and then I can decide which local authority to look at. In this case, I've chosen Birmingham City Council. I could choose, if I can click here, I can choose any local authority I want, but we've got Birmingham City Council here because that happens to be a local authority which is bust. And there we have displayed a variety of local data which is used to create the numbers which appear in the yellow tabs to the right, which show what the fair cost of care is for the various modalities: nursing care, dementia, residential care, dementia. Now, just before I go into that, of course, going back into the history of it, say more than 15 years old, it always depended on receiving information from individual care homes and from groups, which we did in the past pre-COVID. Of course, it was basically killed off by COVID because the care homes were focusing on looking after their residents, and they didn't have the time or the inclination to reply to surveys. So basically, this tool was killed by COVID. But subsequent to COVID, we were then able to reintroduce our regular surveys of care homes in a new form, our care home benchmarking service, and we have got sufficient data from both large and small groups to be able to populate the spreadsheet. So that's what we're showing now. And basically, what it relies on is bang up to date, or at least 2023 to 24 data. So This is the relaunch of a 15-year-old product. So I'm going to go into now. I've gone into Birmingham City Council. Just show you what the bottom line is, which is what the fair costs of care are for Birmingham according to our calculations, and a comparison with what the local authority fees are. So here I'm going into this particular one is on nursing care for people over 65 in 23 to 24. So what that shows is that in the top left-hand corner, our calculations from the data that we have are that the median care home cost per resident stands at, this is a very exact number, £1,144. The average local authority paid fee is £967, and the fee gap is £177. So that is the absolute bottom line of this. It demonstrates that in that particular case, and that's the case of most local authorities, there is a substantial fee gap. And we can do this for nursing care for frail older people, nursing care for dementia, residential care, and residential care for dementia. So it's all the four modalities of care. And then there's a lot of detail about how this is broken down into staff costs and care home premises, etc., etc. Now, what we're doing here, we have everyone will be aware, of course, of the big 2022 fair cost of care exercise, which was covered the whole of England, and there the way in which the data was structured was a little bit different from ours. But we have adjusted the way in which we present the data, so it is an identical format to the 2022 fair cost of care exercise. So the costs are divided into staff, into care home premises, into supplies and services, and into head office costs, return on capital. So it's, as I say, it's identical in format to the fair cost of care exercise. Now, if I can go into some of the more important detail about how the costs are built up. Basically, what this model does is it builds up the total costs from each individual item of cost. As we know, the main cost driver for care homes are staff, and the main and you can divide that into two, basically, into the pay rates and staffing intensity. Now, what I'm going to do is just go into a tab which we call parameters, because what that shows, I'm just illustrating this by looking straight away at the staffing intensity side. And what that shows is the data that we've gathered for 23-24, which is in fact very similar to past year's data, showing the number of hours per resident per week for each of the different staffing types. So what you'll see there, for example, is qualified nursing at 8 hours per resident per week, non-nurse carers about a bit over 20, and then domestic staff at around about 4, chefs, cooks around about 2. So this is not imaginary data. This is data that comes from returns that we've received in 23-24 from our fair cost, from our benchmarking service. So that's how the basic staffing data works. Now I'm going to go back to the example of Birmingham for nursing homes for older people. And before I do that, actually, one thing I've been asked to cover is that if we go back to these parameters, which show the number of hours per resident per week, I remember that this tool is basically it's for care homes for older people. Now, in principle, it could equally be applied to younger adults, and particularly to learning disabilities. But of course, what you find in that area that you can't really standardize for the staff hours per resident per week, because it's as long as a piece of string that the costs and therefore the appropriate fees vary according to the individual resident. whose need for staffing may vary enormously. So that's what differentiates the younger adults from the older people. We can put in these standard rates for older people, but if we were using this for learning disabilities, for example, it would be up to the individual user to specify the staff input and overwrite the sort of factory settings, as it were. So I'm going to go back to the older people's Birmingham example and go up to the top again where the summary is. And you won't be able to read it, but you'll see on the right-hand side there's a slightly different coloured box, which is a note on average local authority paid fee. What this is essentially is a health warning, and it says that we cannot necessarily believe the quote official unquote figures that have been released by the government. And I'm going to go into another tab to show you what these are. And this is the council fees 23-24. What this is for each individual local authority, and this is information which is published by the DHSC. You'll see all of the individual local authorities here, Barking, Dagenham, and so on. It gives a fee rate for 65 plus for 23-24 in terms of pounds per week. Unfortunately, this is provisional data, and in about, I would say, about 10% of the cases, the numbers which have been published by the government cannot really be believed. And one of the main reasons for this is that some of the councils have double counted NHS-funded nursing care. But for 90%, they are reasonable, and we at LaingBuisson are going through each of the doubtful local authorities through an FOI, Freedom of Information, to establish what the actual figures are. And as we get them in, we'll be producing iterations of this model to update them. So the figures I've shown you so far, they are 2023-24, but of course we're entering a period now in which local authorities will be looking at and creating the budget for their 24-25 fees. So I'm now going to put on for the example of Birmingham, 24-25 for nursing care, and that's now gone up to 1225, which is 7% increase. Now, the way in which we've projected these numbers is, first of all, taking the National Living Wage update, which we know, and then various other official Office of National Statistics indices to forecast. And that's and we're pretty confident that is around about the figure that will be expected for Birmingham in this particular case in 24-25. So that's the most important figure and single figure, I suppose. It's what the upgrade we think should be in 24-25. So that's a brief run through the model. Are we reaching a crunch point now? We've forecast that for a long time. There is still gross underfunding by local authorities. Local authorities are facing increasing financial problems. Birmingham is effectively bankrupt. Northampton is as well. Others are following as well. So it is frankly problematic to see how local authorities are going to be able to afford higher fees going forward. But there is little doubt that if they don't, then the service simply can't be provided. So what we're trying to do is to shine a spotlight on what actual real costs are and to assist the sector in its negotiations with local authorities and indeed with the NHS. And I think I've gone up to 10 minutes now. Thank you.
Thanks for that, William. And we're going to move on to obviously the legal and regulatory ramifications that are involved there in a second. But now that we're at triple figures in terms of people that are live on the complimentary webinar that we're hosting today, I may even run a poll looking ahead into 2024 to ask the question whether these people on the webinar today are confident that they're seeing a fair level of care cost as we face into next year. But without further ado, we've been joined by one of the most eminent experts on this topic in the market and powering the webinar today. It's Paul Ridout from Ridout's Law.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everybody. I hope everybody can hear me. I'm going to take you at a canter through my slides, really starting off with what's an important historical note, as William said earlier on. Prior to 1993, public funding for care, I'm sorry, can we move on to the next slide, please? Yeah, prior to 1993, public funding was paid by central government grant. It went out of control from 1978 through to 1993, first of all being capped and then being transferred away from central government because the Treasury didn't like the results, and given to local authorities. SSB was just a grant. Users could pay more and providers could charge more. Next, that's an important historical note. Now, could we have the next slide, please? From 1993, thanks to Mrs. Thatcher, the placements were supported by public funding contracted through local authorities' social services departments. Local authorities fixed prices but were forbidden to raise local taxes to meet cost, which some of us would see as the fundamental flaw in the system, because otherwise there would have been a demographic or democratic issue, because people would have had to pay more in their council tax to meet the costs, and they were not particularly enthusiastic about that. Users, that's the residents, were not allowed to pay top-ups. Anyone else could pay a top-up. They paid it through the local authority in legal terms, and there was obviously a local authority should oppose a means test to establish the, I've lost my slides, I don't know that they could make that top-up, because of course the commitment to the top-up, which initially was only in sort of perhaps tens or 20s of pounds per week, but has risen to significant amounts of money, would fall on the local authority as liability of last resort. So next slide, please. And from 1993 to 2014, it was broadly speaking accepted around that local authorities could set a fixed price for care, almost irrelevant to whether the actual costs of care were met by what the local authority decided to fix. And that's something which I want to address as possibly having been changed. The significance of 2014 is that was with passing of the Care Act, which rationalised and modernised the provision of social care through local authorities. But it is rational and reasonable, using the legalistic terms for local authorities' duties, that the price paid should be capable of purchasing the needed care. I'd like you to bear that in mind. Local authorities had traditionally taken a take it or leave it approach, and it was very difficult to challenge this, given my benchmark that you ought to be able to show that the price paid was capable of purchasing the care, because providers were reluctant individually to provide sufficient detail for perfectly understandable reasons. Now, the next slide, please. The government's ability to research and set a fair price for care failed a couple of years ago through a lack of comprehensive engagement around the sector. Everyone tried. Government and the local authorities didn't like what was coming out, and government didn't particularly like the inevitable conclusion, which is my answer to William, really. If this is to be resolved, then government has to find a way both of extra funding through to the sector, but also ensuring that that funding doesn't get somehow hijacked or removed on its passage through local authorities. And there are other things, maybe a national care service. Whatever it is, it's important that the money that government allocates actually comes through to the front line. The reality, as William said, is that local authorities cannot afford to pay a proper price of care, but in law, non-affordability is no excuse for failing to meet a legal obligation. Next slide, please, Jade. Right, so let's just look at the Care Act of 2014 in very simple terms. sections 12 to 18, local authorities must by law assess eligibility of a user for care. And they must then, having assessed that somebody is eligible, according to their criteria, they must assess whether the user has means to pay for the care and decide how much they contribute. But the gateway to support is eligibility. The means test comes later. Once eligible, the local authority must support when user means are below a financial threshold, and cease responsibility when means exceed. But of course, there can be moving in and out. Inheritance, lottery wins we've all had, the 12-week disregard, rather in shambles now, given that you can't really sell a house in 12 weeks, and what's known as the spouse house exception, where the value of a house is disregarded whilst a dependent spouse or relative is in there. All of this are factors which support our contention that once you're eligible, the local authority must support, subject to keeping under their responsibility the financial means coming to and fro. Next slide, please, Jake. Eligibility remains once assessed, but entitlement arises and lapses for means. But it's for the local authorities to establish means. It's certainly not for care homes or care providers to get involved in inquiring into people's means. Local authorities are obliged, and if they want to establish that there's some contribution to come to them from the users, then that's a matter for them. And they try and sidestep that, sometimes by quite aggressive litigation methods. Next slide, please, Jade. So Section 18 of the Care Act is the important section. Local authorities are required to meet eligible need subject to the means threshold. It's enforceable by law, and we say, very, I think, contentiously so far as local authorities are concerned, that their agreement is not required. So this would particularly apply where someone's in a care home, perhaps they've paid privately, their means have been exhausted, or there's been an increase in costs, or there's been an increase in dependency. You can then launch an argument that the local authority are obliged to pay the correct amount for meeting the needs of care. And it's obvious that the payment must be sufficient to buy the needed care. There's not much use in saying, you need to spend £1,000 a week on care, but we'll give you 750, because that does not go anywhere near, in our view, meeting the obligation. Now, next slide, please, Jade. So who can sue? Certainly care users. If there's a care relationship established, care providers can't sue speculatively, but if someone's in a home and there are increasing needs, yes, lasting powers of attorney, court of protection. Unlikely care or trade associations, because those litigations have been launched to try and establish the credibility or reasonableness or rationality of fees set by local authorities, which we would say now is starting in the wrong place. The right place is what the cost is. Next slide, please. And of course, the requirement to succeed is to prove that the eligible care can only be met at a clearly ascertained price. And that's where this tool, this benchmarking tool, in our view, is an absolutely vital tool to be used so that when you're faced either in negotiations or in a courtroom with saying, show me why the fee that they're offering is not sufficient to meet this care, this will be very useful material without embarrassing providers by forcing them to probe into their own personalized financial situations, which will be many and various. Next slide, please. So just moving on quickly to strategy, it's important to move as quickly as possible to litigation. Don't waste time on negotiations which are going nowhere. Local authorities love stalling. They will pray in aid that they have to set a new year budget and rates by early March at the latest. So they will drag out negotiations, and they do. You will all have experienced this. Then you will reach the first or second week of March, and they'll say, well, we're setting the budget now, far too late for anything, and maybe your time for litigation, certainly judicial review litigation, may be running out. Next slide, please. Tactics. Tactics are important. Early on, establish a reasoned and detailed case for an identified increase. Don't have vacuous negotiations. Get your position down. Get your evidence in. add value argument on legal justification and use the benchmark, or if you wish, your own figures. But if the benchmark is the benchmarking tool is a vital tool to show that you're not being subjective, but you've got objective, rational material. You need to take advice on framework agreements, what they have and what is the room for dispute resolution. Maybe take advice on the availability of the range of local fees. The benchmarking tool will help for that. And also do be careful about competition cartel avoidance. You need to get your lawyers to look at that. Essentially, there shouldn't be any form of people combining together to say, that's the rate we'll charge, you won't get anything else. It's called monopsony. We're saying get a pre-action legal letter with a 28-day compliance deadline. We're running out of time this year. We would say that letter ought to be going out by the end of next week, 21st of December, and you should be aiming to commence proceedings. These are civil debt claims in the court towards the end of January, in this case, 2024. Next slide, please. Other issues, evidence of inflation, which is publicly available and will be factored into various sources, and the material like external factors. Our view is that if statutory requirements are imposed from outside, most traditionally in the national minimum wage, but there can be others, then there is no reason why that increase should not be wholly absorbed by the payer. It is in the private sector. If those sorts of costs, if 10% goes on to national minimum wage, then it should be absorbed by the local authority. And it's interesting to hear in William's example that the shortfall was 7%, and that would be a very useful argument to say, well, what we're actually arguing using the benchmark tool is actually less than the wage increase which has come through, which is nothing to do with specific inflation and nothing to do with the providers where they run the business. It's government saying you may need evidence increased dependency, because this exercise can apply where people get more dependent, and then it can be triggered at any time. If an increase in need is evidence, there should be an increase in fee. Next slide, if there is one, please. We're getting near the end. You'll be glad to know we are at the end. Thank you for listening to me. Sorry it was a canter, but you'll get copies of these slides and happy to talk to anyone about them should you wish. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that, Paul. Paul, this is an area that you've covered for a number of years. Given the accessibility of the data, are we seeing more activity than ever before in seeking out legal counsel and guidance on this very topic?
Yes, it's still not as high as I would wish it to be. And I think local authorities they know perfectly well the risks that they're facing. They know where the dangers are, and they're very adept at using the time factor and the threat that last year's fees will exist unless you agree with us. Hence the need for informed lawyers to be involved from an early stage, and for the local authority to see that you're driving towards a litigated or mediated solution, rather than just waiting until March and accepting whatever's being given, which has been the situation. Essentially, William mentioned 15 years, but I would say it's been the situation probably for 30 years. Probably we're going back 30 years to when local authorities took over the fixing of prices or the contracting of prices. But remember, it is contract, it's not public law. So if you've got a contract in the statute that supports your position, of course with appropriate evidence, then you've got a good case, and your time and money is better spent there than sitting on the table hoping that the local authority will be decent when it can't be.
We ran a poll during that session just to scope out whether the attendees of this call were confident in the fact that they would see a fair level of cost for CUR in 2024. It was a resounding result, with 95% of respondents suggesting that would not be the case. So again, as eminent a conversation as ever before, I'm going to bring back on screen William Lang, but also we're going to get a handle from the user experience in the market from Tony Tiru of Fulcrum CUR.
Thank you, Liam. I think, we see, as soon as we heard of the new, the CAC cost benchmarking tool, we immediately subscribed to it as soon as it was released. We see a 5-fold benefit for care providers that we support. So in the first instance, we see there is an opportunity for informed pricing because by understanding the true cost of providing care, a care home can set fees that are both competitive and also sufficient to cover expenses, therefore ensuring sustainability. So that's informed pricing is certainly the first benefit. Secondly, we see, it certainly helps with budgeting and financial planning, the detailed insights into cost components, which will certainly help in better budgeting and financial planning for care providers. Thirdly, we also see there is a benefit in terms of attracting investment. With clear benchmarks, care homes can now attract investment by demonstrating a sustainable business model. Fourthly, there is also the element of, probably the obvious element of operational efficiency, because by analyzing cost components, care homes can identify areas for operational efficiency and cost savings. Probably the most important benefit, the fifth benefit, is in terms of compliance and negotiation, because these benchmarks aid in compliance with commissioning or even regulatory expectations and provide a basis for negotiating a fair reimbursement of a set of fair reimbursement rates with local authorities and other funding bodies. So that's where we've seen a fivefold benefit in adopting the tool and adopting, using the benchmarks. And we've seen that work in practice as well. We've been able to negotiate fees with providers. For providers with local authorities, with commissioners, or even have here's a basis that they can use to have those discussions. Certainly, someone like Paul would come in, because it's not a walk in the park. There would be pushback from the local authorities and commissioners, so that's where someone like Paul can come in. But certainly, we've seen the benefit already, and really delighted that the tools up and running and available for the sector. Thank you.
It's obviously quite an emotive topic. We've had a number of questions for the panel, so I'm going to run through a few of those in the precious moments that we have left, if that's okay. William, the first one, potentially two, is going to come to yourself, and it's on the application of the toolkit itself. So the first question is the model only for older adults, that's 65 plus, or is similar data available for the younger adult population as well?
Right, the tool can be used for younger adults, but the factory set staff intensity figures would have to be individually varied, resident by resident, because there's no standard vanilla for learning disabilities.
Mm-hmm. And is that the same application for working age adults as well?
Yes.
Wonderful, wonderful. When you were presenting, there was a stat that you cut off, which was a 7% variance, I believe, for Birmingham. You may or may not recall that. That was a Birmingham specific stat, wasn't it, rather than a national percentage that was being reflected?
Birmingham specific, but it's likely to be quite similar for all other local authorities, because the main driver is payroll, national living wage, but there is a lower inflation rate for other contributors to cost. Okay.
I don't know if there's a specific answer to this question, but I will ask it regardless. And it was around what is there a kind of an acceptable profit margin percentage to be making when providing residential care?
Right. This is the most controversial aspect. Always, when we're talking to them, we've done many fair cost exercises, paid for, commissioned by local authorities, by providers, or jointly. And our standard response is this, and there's some very solid evidence behind it, that you have to divide the profits into two. One is the return on capital, which should be, we believe, around 6%. And then the return on operations, which we believe should be a 10% markup on operating costs. I won't go into the reasons why, because it would take too long, but that's what it is.
Very well politically navigated there, William. Another question, potentially for yourself, although I would open it up. It's from Charles Taylor, which is the fair cost of care figures collected are a number of years old now, according to Charles. And when they try to use these to discuss fees for 24-25, the rate of inflation on those is heavily argued by councils. Is there a good kind of data-driven approach / question this question around inflationary environment?
No, well, absolutely, and that's why the fair cost of care exercise in 2022 that was set at April, and it was just at the start of the Ukraine war, and there's been a lot of inflation since. But what our model does now is to take into account not hot off the press, but 2023 to 24 data. So it is up to date basically now through this toolkit.
Wonderful. Paul, this next one could be coming your way. It could be a bit of free legal guidance for an anonymous poster. Birmingham City Council do not allow providers to charge third-party top-ups unless it's for enhanced services. And the question posed is that legal?
No.
Short and sweet. Wonderful. We might not get through all of these, but we'll certainly address all of the questions in the follow-up comms as well. And you will include in that follow-up comms more information about accessing the toolkit. Varun Sharma has asked, and this may be a question for yourself, William, is there a toolkit for domiciliary care?
No, there isn't. It's more problematic, and I won't go further into that, but it really is quite problematic.
Okay, thank you for that. For being candid. Mark Cunningham has asked what happened to the debate / challenge where the CHC price is fixed at a rate equivalent to nursing plus FNC. So needs increase, but the price does not. He's saying that there was a suggestion that this was not a legal option for the NHS or the ICSs.
Shall I come in there? I mean, FNC is an individual grant via local authorities from the NHS budget to reimburse the users of nursing care for a fixed sum. It's not intended to be a reflection of the total cost of nursing care, nor should it be seen that way. It's not a payment in essence to the care provider. It's a payment to the care user to reflect their loss of free NHS care if they're not in hospital following a famous legal case towards the end of the last century. But it's a grant to the individual, not to the care home, although in practice it's received by the care home and credited back.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. We've got a couple of minutes left, so I'll rattle through a couple more of these, and as I say, we'll address some of those in the follow-up communications to the webinar. Colin Newton has asked a very important question, which is one for yourself, William. How does Colin get hold of the toolkit?
I think we give his contact details and we'll contact.
Wonderful. And that'll be the same for everybody who's joined the webinar today. Wonderful. Ram Joshi has asked, is it possible to address the talk about return on capital employed rates in the new interest rate environment that exists, William? Is that something that you could address?
The evidence is that there are appropriate rates of interest which are determined by the risk of any activity. Care home provision is it's a moderately risky business. The rate of return to be expected by providers and investors do not vary as substantially, as significantly as, say, mortgage rate interest would. So there's not that much difference pre and post.
Wonderful. Final question that I'll raise because I'm conscious of time. But again, it's from an anonymous joiner of the complimentary webinar today. And the question is, what does fair price mean? And it's with the context of fair for a nationwide company with large HO costs does not equal fair versus a local charity with 2 homes running on a non-for-profit basis. So in the opinions of the expert panel that we've convened today, what does fair price mean for yourselves in terms of the sector?
I'll leave others to answer that first. I do have an answer myself, but
yeah, go for it.
Okay, well, fair. Well, what's fair? Fair for the individual worker in care homes. That's one thing. fair for the provider. I think primarily we're talking about fair for the provider here, and that is a fair price is a price which will give them adequate recompense for their investment. And I don't think there's any different fair price for charities and for for-profit providers. It's the same.
Tony, Paul, would you agree?
I certainly agree with the last point. The fair price for care should be applied to whatever size of home, whatever sort of funding or background of home. The fair price, as I say, it's fair for the providers primarily, fair for the staff, and fair for actually the user too, because it's the user, the resident or other user needs to know that there's sufficient money being paid to ensure they get the proper level of care. Inevitably, there is cross-subsidization and also there is failure in care, and we mustn't forget the ever-presence of our regulator, the Care Quality Commission, who doesn't really understand or wish to understand that the increasing costs of providing the proper level of care are a matter for the provider, and it doesn't matter if they're not getting sufficient from a government source. And you see very much less regulatory intervention in private pay homes where they can manage their fees in the usual commercial way.
Thanks for that, Paul. It brings us to the end of this complimentary webinar. As I say, more information will follow to the attendees today, including how to access the toolkit and further information about the legal guidance and counsel services that Paul and Ridout could be providing on this very topic itself. Thank you to all of the members of the panel, Tony, William and Paul, for joining today. Have a wonderful day.